In the heart of a violent sandstorm, tearing through the Mojave Desert, a newborn lay curled beside a cactus, abandoned to die. And then, from the blood-red dusk, a wild horse emerged. No sound, no fear, only silence and a broken body shielding the child from the storm. That moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Subscribe now to follow our next haunting emotional storytelling films that will stay with you long after the screen fades. The Mojave night was not silent. It shrieked. It clawed. It tore at the fabric of reality like a wounded thing. The wind came first, dry, sharp as broken glass, slicing across the desert floor in wild swirls, lifting ancient dust into the air. Cactus shadows stretched long and twisted under the flickering glow of a dying moon. The kind of night where time didn't pass, it loitered breathless, waiting for something unholy to happen. And then headlights. A sleek black SUV crept across the sand, its tires grating against rocks like bone on bone. The vehicle didn't belong here. Its chrome glint was sterile, corporate, surgically clean. It hummed to a stop beside a towering Joshua tree surrounded by nothing but salt bush and empty space. The engine stilled. Silence tried to reclaim the land, but it was different now. Tense, listening. The driver's door opened with a mechanical click, and out stepped a man who looked like he had never touched the earth with anything other than his shoes. Clayton Ward, pressed navy suit. Loafers polished to a glassy sheen. Hair perfectly slicked back despite the restless wind. Eyes like expensive ice, clear, cold, uncrackable. He stood for a moment, letting the wind buffet his suit jacket, though he didn't shiver. His gaze wandered across the desert horizon without interest, as if he were inspecting an empty room before switching off the lights. Then he moved to the back of the SUV, opened the hatch. From inside, he pulled a cardboard box. It was the kind used to carry files or printer paper battered at the corners from recent rough handling. Its flaps were uneven, as if hastily taped back together. But from within it came the sound that fractured the night, a baby's cry. It wasn't full-throated or confident, it was gasping, searching, already cracking from dehydration. It was the sound of something utterly confused, utterly vulnerable. A sound that didn't belong here in this brutal world of dust and nothing. Clayton didn't look down. He walked 10 slow steps into the desert, past a skeletal cholla cactus with red dust coating its spines. He knelt his knee, barely brushing the ground, and set the box down against the base of a dry, ancient shrub. The baby inside wailed louder, as if it knew. But Clayton Ward simply stood, adjusted his tie, checked his watch, not for time, but out of habit. The wind ripped through the open land and tugged at the edges of his suit, as if trying to pull him back. Still, he did not look again. Instead, he turned and walked. Each step was deliberate, firm, final. He did not stumble, did not hesitate. He returned to his car like a man walking out of a business meeting, not someone who had just left his own blood in the sand to die. The vehicle started. The engine hummed obediently. He drove away. A minute later, the wind picked up. Not a breeze, not a gust, but a rolling wall of grit and dust that swept across the flatlands like a judgment. A sandstorm. One of the kinds that stripped paint off metal, that buried landmarks, that silenced evidence. By the time Clayton was a half-mile gone, the box was already half covered in red powder. The child's cries were muffled beneath wind and grit, and the tire tracks gone like they'd never been there. The desert closed in, but Mojave keeps its own ghosts, its own guardians, and from far miles away, beyond the ridge where the fire-scarred scrubland gave way to cracked earth, something stirred. At first, it was just a tremble in the stillness, a shift in the silence that felt like memory. Then the faintest sound, hooves, steady, singular, like punctuation against chaos. Then it came into view through the storm, through the dust. A black figure, sleek but battered. Legs lean like coiled wire. A mane tangled with ash and thorn. Scars marked its flanks like old runes burned in, not healed. The horse moved like it had nothing left to lose. Its nostrils flared against the wind, teeth, clenched eyes wide, not wild, not mad, focused, determined. This was Ash, not a ranch horse, not a pet, not anyone's. Ash had been wild once, then caught, then broken, then burned. They said he ran into a wildfire to escape a trailer crash. Crashed through barbed wire, knocked down men with guns. He survived the fire, barely disappeared into the Mojave, and hadn't been seen since. Until now, he was moving against the wind, each step like defiance. He wasn't running, not yet. He was listening. The wind carried screams differently out here. Sometimes it twisted them. Made you think you heard them when you didn't. Made you forget them when you had. But Ash didn't forget. His ears flicked, head tilted. Something faint but real tugged at his core. That cry. High, broken. Desperate. He turned toward it. At first he walked sniffing the air. His steps dug deep into the sand, leaving imprints shaped like broken crescents. The wind tried to erase them. Failed. The scent grew stronger. Human. Infant. Faint blood. Sweat. Panic. Then he saw it. Not the box. Not yet. But something. A plastic bottle cap. A torn receipt. Trash maybe, but not wild trash. Human trash. Out of place. Recent. He stopped. Ears forward, nostrils flaring. A shriek broke across the wind, like glass against steel. This time he galloped, not fast, deliberate. Each motion calculating energy distance threat. The boulders rose around him like rusted teeth, but he ducked and dodged, muscle memory guiding his path. And then finally the box. Ash didn't slow until he was nearly on top of it. The cardboard was shaking, rattling against the wind. A faint, thin cry came from inside. The baby was barely audible now. Ash circled once, snorted, moved closer. He lowered his head slow, not to startle. His breath blew strands of dust off the box lid. The scent was stronger now. Milk, sweat, synthetic cloth, human skin. Tiny fingers poked through a torn side. He stared. And then he did something no one would believe if they saw it. He stepped between the wind and the box. Turned his body, curved himself into a living barrier, and stood firm. The sand hit him first, stinging, biting, crawling down his neck and spine. He blinked once. Didn't move. Then twice. Still didn't move. The child's cries slowed. Not silenced, but steadied. Ash exhaled hard. He wasn't calm, but he wasn't leaving. The storm howled harder. Lightning lit up the rim of the canyon like a throat about to scream. But Ash stayed. His front hoof stamped once, then again. He began to circle the box, using his weight to compact the sand around it, marking the spot, pressing the shape in like a brand. Then he did something strange. He nudged a dried tumbleweed toward the box, then another. Then, with the side of his leg, he scratched lines in the dirt arcs, semicircles like half-forgotten trail markers. From above, it might look like a symbol or a signal, but to Ash, it was instinct, not human logic, not training. Just knowing that someone somewhere might need to find this spot. That maybe, just maybe, the world still had a reason to look. The baby cried again, a gasp, this time short but sharp. Ash turned his head, leaned down, snorted once. And then through the red haze, his ears twitched. A sound, not wind, not animal. A shutter click. Ash had seen fire. Not just the kind that danced gently in campgrounds or curled beneath the bellies of cowboy stoves, but the kind that howled ravenous with teeth and purpose. Fire that moved with intent. Fire that didn't warm, but consumed. It had started, they said, from a forgotten spark. A chain drag, maybe, or a cigarette flicked too close to the dry brush. No one ever took the blame. The land did. He had been roped, restrained, and loaded into a livestock trailer that day. Ash younger, then less scarred, but just as feral. He remembered the vibration of panic through the metal floor, the shrieking of others, the thunder of hooves against steel as animals fought to escape confinement while the walls around them grew hotter. Then came the screaming of men of mares of the earth itself, and something inside him broke, not with fear, with clarity. Ash didn't wait for permission. He kicked once, twice, and the metal gate cracked. Someone had tried to grab his halter, yelling face streaked with soot. But Ash's eyes had already turned black. Not mad, not wild, just done. He lunged through fire. The wall of flame ate through the oak fencing around the holding corral like it was tissue paper. Ash barreled through it, mane lit in streaks of glowing ember tail trailing smoke, his left flank already blistering. He hit the dirt outside the inferno and ran, didn't look back, didn't hesitate. He didn't run from fire. He ran from people. They'd brought him here. They'd locked him in that steel box. They'd treated him like cargo, not creature. He never forgot. And the fire, it hadn't killed him. It had branded him. Scars marked his shoulder where flame met muscle. One scar curved like a crescent moon, another like a jagged V. Together they looked like a distorted hoofprint pressed into his skin, a symbol as if the fire had declared him its survivor. They tried to track him, the rangers and rescue workers. But Mojave keeps what it wants. Ash vanished into the red rocks, into the wind, and he stayed gone. For months he roamed. No herd, no master, no pasture. He found shelter beneath the ridges, water in the half-remembered spring solitude in the canyons where even hawks didn't cry. No humans, no ropes, no fire, just silence. Until now. Now the sound pierced everything. A cry not like a foal's, not a calf lost in the brush. This was higher, thinner. It clawed its way into the air like it didn't belong, like it refused to. Ash stopped cold. The wind whipped dust into his face, and he blinked against it. His ears turned. That sound again. Distant, weak, but wrong. He snorted and took a step, then another. He moved against the gale muscles twitching beneath his smoke-scarred skin. The scent was clearer now. Faint milk, synthetic cloth, sweat and fear. Human, infant. He didn't bolt. Not yet. His steps were slow, intentional. He moved like something waking up from sleep that had gone too long. Then the wind changed and the sound vanished. Ash halted. He stood still for a long moment, hooves sinking slightly into the shifting sand sides, heaving with the effort of restraint. He knew wind could lie, but instincts didn't. He tilted his head toward the left. Sand stung his eyes. He turned, and then just there beneath the outline of a gnarled mesquite bush, something unnatural. A corner, cardboard. Ash approached cautiously. His breath came faster now, nostrils wide. He stopped beside it, peered down. The wind yanked at the box flaps, revealing flashes of movement inside pink raw wriggling. A baby. It squirmed weakly, face blotchy and wet, eyes barely open. The lips moved, but the cry had faltered, just soft whimpers now, like breath that couldn't decide whether it should stay or leave. Ash lowered his head. He didn't neigh, didn't stomp, just stood. The child turned slightly, one tiny hand reaching out without aim. It brushed the inside of the box, like it might find something solid in a world built of heat and emptiness. Ash stepped forward. He positioned himself sideways, angled his body so the wind hit his scarred side. The blast sent dust cascading over his back and mane, but the box behind him stayed still. He dug his front hooves in, braced. The sand kept coming. He didn't move, only his breath changed shorter now, faster. He hadn't felt heat like this since the fire. But this time it didn't come from the trees, it came from memory. Each gust felt like the slap of flame again, the pain of muscle tearing away from purpose. But he didn't retreat. He turned his head, scanned the ground. Then he walked 5 paces in a circle around the box, leaving a stamped perimeter of hoof prints, 1, 2, 3, 4. He dragged a front hoof outward, scraping the sand, then kicked sideways with a back leg, pushing a chunk of brush closer. A branch broke. He grabbed it between his teeth, awkward, but determined, and dropped it near the box. Then another. Each one placed, not random, a crude marker, a message no human might understand, but one another creature might see. He returned to his position, lowered his body closer to the earth. Not lying down, not relaxing, but shielding. The child coughed, just once. A dry, breathless sound. Ash blinked. His ears twitched. A line of red had started running down his flank where the wind had torn open an old burn. It mixed with the dust, turning the sand beneath him into something darker, rust-colored. The first droplet landed next to the baby's box. A symbol, a signature. Ash didn't look at it, but he stayed. The night deepened. The wind roared harder, and still he didn't move. Not when the cold cut through the heat. Not when thunder rumbled far off beyond the canyon wall. Not even when a distant engine echoed in the distance, breaking the desert's silence like a crack in glass. He didn't move until a sound, sharp, mechanical, a click. He raised his head. Eyes caught a glint of something. Movement on the edge of a dune. Another presence still distant. Not predator, not threat, but watching. Ash didn't flee. He simply turned his body further, placing himself fully between the child and whatever was coming. And from the wound on his shoulder, blood dripped again, quiet, precise, into a hoofprint, a burnt one, etched in red. The wind rocked the van like a cradle built for ghosts. Nina Caldwell lay curled in the back seat of her rusted-out Dodge Caravan camera bag, tucked under her head like a half-hearted pillow denim jacket pulled tight over her chest. The Mojave night screamed against the windshield in waves. But inside it was still, and thick like breath caught in the throat of time. The Leica sat on the passenger seat, old and scuffed, the lens cracked on the edge from a fall she never fixed. She hadn't used it in weeks, maybe longer. It had become more of a relic now, a piece of who she was, when she still believed stories could save people. She turned on her side, eyes half-lidded, staring at the ceiling where the roof lining had long since peeled away, leaving only patches of yellow foam. One hand rested on her stomach, unconsciously tracing the shape of the small scar beneath her ribs. The scar was surgical. The damage wasn't. Her son's name had been Tyler. He was 6 when the car hit them, when the world folded in half and took her voice with it. Not her literal voice. She could still speak. She just didn't. Not really. Not about anything that mattered. After the funeral, she sold the apartment. Then the studio. Then the cameras, except the Leica. That one she kept not because she loved it, but because it hurt. Tonight was just another chapter in a long book of vanishing, until she heard it. A sound faint and fractured, threaded between howls of wind. High-pitched, barely there. She sat up, not sure she'd heard anything at all. The desert did that. Sometimes it whispered. Played tricks. Made you think you were not alone, just so it could laugh at you later. Still, she waited. Then again, there it was. She rolled down the window a crack. Sand peppered her face instantly, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the darkness. Nothing but brush and shifting dunes. She was about to close it when something caught her, no, someone. 2 eyes, bright, not human, reflecting light that wasn't there, staring straight through the window. She flinched so hard she banged her knee against the steering column. The keys still dangling from the ignition rattled like old bones. Her breath hitched. She looked again. A horse, not just any horse, black, silent, standing impossibly still just 10 yards away, like a statue carved from shadow. Mane whipping in the wind, but the body motionless. Eyes burning like twin coals in the storm. She froze. Ash didn't move. The wind carried another sound, the cry. This time clearer. Real. Not imagination, not memory. A baby. Nina's instincts reawakened so suddenly it hurt. Every cell in her body snapped back to attention. She grabbed the camera bag without thinking, slung it over her shoulder, then kicked open the door. The wind slammed into her like a wall. Dust stung her cheeks, filled her mouth with grit. She wrapped the denim tighter and stepped out into the storm. Ash watched. Didn't approach. Didn't run. Just turned slightly as if to nod towards something behind him. She followed. The earth was uneven, sand giving way beneath her boots. The van disappeared into the haze behind her. Every few steps, she looked for the horse, and each time he was further ahead. Just far enough to lead. Never too far to lose. Then she saw the first marker, a bent tumbleweed, crushed, not natural. Then another, this one closer to a scuff in the dirt, like a dragged hoof. She hesitated, looked around. No sign of a trail, no tracks leading anywhere. Ash turned to face her directly. His body was angled against the wind, shielding something she couldn't yet see. Then he stepped aside. The box was half buried. Nina ran. Her knees hit the ground hard. She didn't feel it. The cardboard was nearly split at the seam. Inside, the baby was curled in a fetal twist, face red and slick with sweat. crying hoarsely, almost silently now, lips cracked, skin burning. Jesus Christ. Her voice came out in a whisper she hadn't meant to speak. She reached in, lifted the infant carefully. The weight was barely there. She cradled the child to her chest, pressing him into the crook of her neck. He twitched. Fingers gripped the edge of her jacket. So small. The kind of small Tyler had once been. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to, not yet. Ash stood behind her like a monolith. She looked up at him, eyes meeting his across the empty space between species. His sides rose and fell with effort. Blood dripped from one flank, just a trickle dark against darker. "You did this," she murmured. He didn't react. She rose slowly, baby still against her. Wind curling through her hair now. The sand didn't bite so hard anymore, it just passed. She turned, saw the trail she'd taken barely visible now. There'd be no help coming, no cell signal out here. She had to get back to the van. She looked at Ash one more time. "I don't know who you are," she said, "or what you lost. But thank you." He blinked. Then he turned his body, cutting through the storm again, and vanished into the dust, as if he'd never been there. She didn't see the blood trail he left behind. Didn't see how one final drop landed inside the circle of hoofprints he'd stamped earlier, blooming in the red sand like ink on parchment. She just walked back to the van, and the baby finally stopped crying. For the first time since entering the desert, it slept. The baby was so quiet now that Nina felt afraid. Not a newborn, should be sleeping kind of quiet. But a silence too thin, too still. It was the silence of a body, burning from within. The kind that came before failure. She held him tighter. Her fingers shook around his tiny form. His head buried against her collarbone, the damp warmth of him seeping into the denim of her jacket. His skin was hot, not the flushed pink of life, but the scalded heat of panic. His breathing came fast and shallow, like paper caught in a storm. She whispered his name, except he had none, so she said nothing. Her knees buckled and she sank into the sand. The sky above twisted with bruised clouds. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, lightning cracked, brief, distant, soundless. Wind curled like an old whisper around her face, brushing grains of grit into the corners of her eyes. She blinked, but the tears didn't fall. Not yet. Ash stood 10 feet away, his body angled to block the worst of the wind, mane tangled with burrs and blood. He didn't approach, just stared. Those eyes, dark, unwavering, held hers, and in them, Nina saw something that clawed at the deepest part of her recognition. Not of her, but of the moment. As if the horse knew what it was to hold life in your arms and still feel powerless. She pressed her lips to the baby's scalp. She tried to speak. What came out was a single sob, shattering and sharp. Her hands shook harder, not from cold, but from memory. She had held a child like this before, smaller even. Tyler had been premature. Came 2 months early with lungs full of fight and a heartbeat like a tiny drum. She had memorized the rise and fall of his chest in NICU shadows. She'd whispered promises against his forehead that she'd always keep him safe, always bring him home, always protect his story. She broke them all. It had been a lake trip, just the two of them. Tyler on a rented paddleboard, laughing, flapping his arms. She turned her head for 5 seconds, just 5. The board flipped. The silence that followed had lasted a lifetime. They found his body 20 minutes later, caught under the pier. She hadn't gone back in the water since. She hadn't touched a child since, until now. Her jaw clenched. The baby shifted just slightly and whimpered. The noise cracked something open in her. She gasped, dropped her head, and cried. Not the cinematic, beautiful kind. Not the neat tears of actresses. These came raw. Uglier than truth. A body folded in on itself. Shoulders shuddering. Chin wet. No sound but air being ripped from lungs. Ash stepped forward. 1 pace. Another. He stopped just beside her now, hooves sinking into the soft edge of the dune. His breath came heavy clouds of steam in the cold. And still he didn't touch her. He just stood. The baby moaned again. That was enough. Nina pulled the child closer and rose. She was unsteady. Her legs remembered grief more than strength. But she forced 1 step. Then another. Ash turned. Led. They walked together. Woman, horse, infant, into the directionless dark, guided by instinct and nothing more. The van was half buried in red dust now. One tire already invisible, it leaned sideways like it was giving up. She climbed into the back seat, laid the baby across her lap, rummaged in the glove box for the bottle of emergency water. The cap flew off too fast, splashing her jeans. She tilted a few drops onto her fingers, ran them gently along the baby's cracked lips. He sucked weakly. Relief was not joy, but it was close. She pulled her jacket off, wrapped it tighter around him. Her skin pebbled with the cold, but she didn't notice. Ash stood outside the window, still watching. She looked at him, really looked this time. His flank shimmered with dried blood, the wound reopened by the storm. His eyes were clouded, tired, but alert. "What do you want?" she whispered, voice hoarse. He didn't move. She reached for the camera in her bag, lifted it halfway, then stopped. No, this moment wasn't for the world. Not yet. This wasn't a headline. It was a reckoning. She climbed out again, baby bundled in her arms. Ash stepped back. She knelt beside him in the sand and laid her free hand on his neck. Rough, coarse, warm. Ash didn't flinch. For one heartbeat, the wind died. And in that fragile hush, Nina breathed. "I'm taking him," she said. Not to anyone. Just the air. Just herself. Just to the version of her that had once promised to never fail again. Ash turned his head slightly like a nod. Then he stepped forward and began to walk. Slow, measured, leaving hoofprints behind that smoked faintly a soft ghost of ash in the red. She followed. The baby stirred, opened his eyes. Not wide, but enough. Enough for Nina to see something she hadn't in years. Hope. Small, yes, but living, like fire refusing to die. The first thing Nina did before the road swallowed her signal was lift the Leica and take the shot. Click! The viewfinder framed Ash's silhouette perfectly. His blood-stained flank, the half-moon scar on his shoulder catching morning light, the burned red soil beneath his hooves. He stood motionless in the wake of her van, eyes locked on her through the rearview mirror, like he was watching history retreat. Click! Another shot, this one closer. A hoofprint in the dust, still faintly smoking where a few hot drops of blood had fallen. The ashes curling along its edge formed a crude, haunting symbol. She lowered the camera. Her hands were steady. For the first time in years, the child, still nameless, lay swaddled in her jacket on the passenger seat. He breathed with small, steady effort, lips stained from the electrolyte water she'd managed to find under the front seat. They reached the town of Ambrose just after dawn. A single main road, gas station, hardware store, sheriff's office, and a squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights, Ambrose Medical Clinic. She parked crooked in the emergency lane, didn't wait for protocol. The door slammed open, and a nurse looked up from behind the desk, just as Nina burst through, jacket clutched against her chest like a shield. "My baby," she said. "He's burning up." Not a lie, just not the whole truth. The nurse screamed for help. Someone wheeled out a gurney. Nina laid the child down and took 3 steps back. She didn't follow. Just stood there swaying slightly, watching the blur of motion until a voice cut through it all. "You found him." Nina turned. Dr. Evie Parker. 40s. Crisp white coat over flannel. Hair pinned back with a pencil. Her eyes sharp, not just with medicine, but with memory. Nina swallowed. He was alone. Out past the ridge. In town. No, the Mojave. Past the switchbacks. Evie blinked once. Hard. Someone left him there. Nina didn't answer. She didn't have to. Evie stepped closer. Lowered her voice. "You bring him in. You do the right thing. But if this is what it feels like, I'm guessing you're not the one who made him bleed." Nina exhaled, nodded once. Evie's tone softened, but only slightly. "He's in heat shock, but you got him in time." Relief swept through Nina like a wind so strong it nearly knocked her over. Evie looked past her to the window. "Did you come alone?" There it was, again that sense. The unspoken weight between women who knew what it was to bury things deep. "I wasn't alone out there," Nina said finally. "Not really." Evie watched her carefully. "Go wash up. You're covered in sand and blood." "I know." Evie leaned in, lowered her voice to a whisper. "Don't say anything to the police yet. Let me get the kids stabilized first, then we talk." Nina looked up, and for the first time since the desert, she saw something that almost resembled trust. But trust didn't last long in Ambrose. 15 minutes later, 2 officers stepped into the clinic. One tall, bald, sunburned. The other wiry and thick-mustached with the posture of someone who never let the war end. Carl Brewster, the taller one, announced, tapping his badge. Ambrose PD. The mustached one gave a small, deliberate nod. Deputy Randall. Mind if we ask a few questions, ma'am? Evie stepped forward. She's shaken. Let her sit. Carl didn't flinch. That ain't up to you, Doc. Evie squared her shoulders. She found an abandoned child in the desert and brought him here. You can show some damn patience. Randall crossed his arms. Brewster turned to Nina. How'd you come across the baby? I was camping. Heard a sound. Found him near a bush. Just like that, Randall asked. No tire tracks. No footprints. Storm wiped everything. You alone? Yes. Carl leaned in. Too close. You know leaving a kid in the wild's a felony, right? I didn't leave him. But you didn't call it in either. Nina glanced at Evie. Evie cut in. She had no signal. We barely get bars here. Brewster didn't like that answer. You could see it in the tightening of his jaw. You some kind of reporter? I was. You still carrying gear? Yes. You photographed the scene. Nina hesitated. Brewster smirked. That's what I thought. Evie stepped between them. That'll be enough. Brewster paused. Randall didn't. We'll need to collect the baby's clothing and get samples. Maybe there's trace evidence. DNA. That sort of thing. Evie gave a curt nod. Already bagged. And the blood on him. Nina stiffened. Evie walked to her tray, pulled up a report in progress. Traces of dried animal blood. Horse, to be exact. Both officers blinked. Horse, Randall asked. Evie nodded slowly. We also found a single dark strand. Horsehair. Embedded in the jacket fibers. Carl's face twitched. You're saying a damn horse rescued a baby? Evie didn't flinch. I'm saying something stood between that baby and a sandstorm. Something warm-blooded. Something that bled. Carl snorted. Maybe your friend here is playing hero to cover her own tracks. Evie took one step forward. You're accusing a woman of abandoning a child she risked her life to save with no proof. Carl turned to Randall. We'll need to keep her here. She's involved. Nina stood suddenly, her voice calm, low. I'm not running, but I didn't abandon him. Who did Randall ask? Nina said nothing. Carl Brewster narrowed his eyes. I know you. You're the one with the dead kid, right? From Portland. Evie stepped in hard. Enough, Carl. But the words had already landed. Nina's chest tightened. Her fingers curled into fists. Did you think saving this one would undo it? He said. Nina didn't cry. She turned and walked to the window, eyes burning. Outside, the street was quiet. The sky still bruised with morning. Ash was nowhere in sight. But she knew he was out there, waiting, watching, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Evie walked over and stood beside her. Softly, I've seen a lot of cruelty in this town. But not like that. This wasn't some teen mom panicking. This was planned. Nina nodded. Evie lowered her voice. You keep your story straight. I'll make sure he's safe. Nina turned toward her. And the horse, she asked. Evie smiled grim. We just made him the key witness in a felony. They both knew how ridiculous it sounded, and neither laughed. Because sometimes the truth rides on four legs and bleeds red in the dust. At first glance, Clayton Ward was the perfect candidate. The kind of man who looked like he'd been poured into a suit by God himself. Salt and pepper hair jawline sharp enough to draw blood, and a voice that folded every camera lens into submission. He was a product meticulously packaged. Every appearance choreographed, every handshake documented, every press photo lit with righteous glow. Family, integrity, Nevada first. That was the slogan. The truth didn't rhyme so neatly. Inside a luxury hotel suite in downtown Reno, Clayton stood by the mirror, adjusting the knot on his crimson tie. The morning sun reflected off the glass windows of the skyline, painting golden streaks across the walls. His campaign manager, Judith Klein, shuffled papers beside him, murmuring polling numbers and debate prep. Clayton didn't hear her. He was staring at the cuff of his sleeve, at the faint edge of a tattoo, long since faded just above his wrist. He pulled the cuff lower. Sir Judith said. He turned. You said something about Fallon County. Yes. Your numbers are up since last week's church appearance. The family values angle is working. Clayton nodded, expression unreadable. Across the room, his wife Ellen sat stiffly on the velvet couch. She held a teacup she didn't drink from, her gaze fixed on the floor. The adoption agency had called again that morning. Still nothing, Ellen Clayton said gently. She looked up smiling with practiced grace. Everything's fine, darling. Focus on the speech. But her eyes, just for a second, flicked toward his wrist. He tugged the cuff again. Buried things don't stay buried. Not in a state built on bones and gambling. That same morning, hundreds of miles south, Nina sat in a borrowed corner of Evie Parker's office with her Leica plugged into an ancient desktop computer. She'd transferred the photos. Now she was combing through them, zooming, adjusting exposure, sharpening pixels. She wasn't looking for art. She was looking for truth. Click. The hoof print burned into ash. Ash's eye reflecting the baby's open hand. Click. A close-up of the torn cloth she found near the bush. Hand-stitched embroidery in blue. At first glance, generic. But then she zoomed in. A pattern. A mandala-style spiral intercut with petal shapes. Stylized. Expensive. Not from a roadside store. She froze. She remembered that pattern. Not in this lifetime, but in a flash. Then click. One still frame from the video she'd taken in the van after laying the baby down. Ash had been standing in the background, but on the far right edge, blurry barely there, a vehicle. Half covered in sand, abandoned at an angle behind the rocks. She'd ignored it before. Now she paused the frame, enhanced contrast. Something hung from the rear-view mirror. A cloth, that same spiral pattern. She inhaled, opened another folder, one she hadn't looked at in years. Old assignments, political events, interviews. She scanned the thumbnails quickly. There, the Ward Family Fundraiser, Reno. She clicked. Image Clayton shaking hands with donors. In rolled sleeves, summer heat, no jacket. She zoomed in on his right forearm. There it was. Barely visible under the tan line and aging skin. A tattoo. Circular. Petal shapes. Faded but identical. She sat back, blood roaring in her ears. Evie entered moments later holding a file. He's stable, she said. The baby? Nina nodded. Her mouth was dry. Evie. Do you know who Clayton Ward is? Evie snorted. The man who wants to turn Mojave into a luxury retreat. Everyone in the state knows him. Nina turned the screen. Evie leaned in, silent. The image showed the tattoo. Then the cloth. Then a side-by-side of the embroidered piece Nina found near the box. Evie's eyes narrowed. I thought he and his wife were trying to adopt. They are, Nina said. But she's infertile. It's public knowledge. It's part of their campaign. We understand loss. Evie folded her arms. You think he fathered the child? I don't think, Nina whispered. I know. She pulled another photo, a scanned hospital registry from a source she hadn't used in years. The OB ward in Henderson. 6 months ago. Nina pointed to the name Maria Elena Morales. Undocumented. No insurance. No birth certificate issued. Discharged 2 days after delivery. Evie looked at her. Where is she now? Gone. No trace. No forwarding contact. Her work record ends 3 days after the birth. Evie's face went cold. You think she was silenced? I think the baby is hers. And I think someone wanted that baby to disappear before someone traced the timeline. Evie sat down heavily. Jesus Christ. Nina stared at the image of the baby in the van, then at the image of the tattoo, a spiral, a flower, a warning. Clayton Ward, she whispered, buried his mistake in the Mojave and thought the sand would do the rest. Evie looked up, but he didn't count on a horse. Nina smiled grimly. No, he didn't. Down in Ambrose, officer Carl Brewster slammed his fist on the desk. That woman's hiding something, he told Randall. Randall raised an eyebrow. You think she dumped a kid and then rescued him? She's lying. All of them lie. You're seeing shadows. She's a city girl. Soft, with a camera and a dead kid. And now she finds another baby in the desert wrapped in silk and secrets. Doesn't make sense. Randall sipped his coffee. You don't trust her. I don't trust anything that comes from Portland. Randall didn't argue. Back in Evie's office, Nina printed the images. She didn't know what her next move was, but she knew what her last one had to be. Make it impossible for him to hide again. Because monsters don't live under beds. They run for governor. She posted the photo at 2:43 a.m., lit only by the cracked screen of an old MacBook in Evie's back office. No filter, no cropping, no captions engineered for virality. Just a raw, gut-level image, the baby wrapped in a worn denim jacket. One tiny fist curled near his cheek, the desert light casting long shadows from the edge of a hospital bed. She typed, "Who left the angel in the sandstorm?" and hit post, then waited. At first it was just static, a few likes, 1 or 2 crying face emojis, a heart from an old journalist friend in New Mexico. Then a share, then 5, then 50. Within 2 hours, the image had 400 reactions. By sunrise, it had fractured the internet in two. One half wept, the other attacked. This is staged. Come on, no one finds a baby in the desert. This woman lost her own kid, and now she's clout chasing, probably one of those migrant babies. Sad, but not our problem. Bless her for saving that little angel. Look at the horse in the background. That thing ain't normal. Whoever left that baby to die deserves a jail cell and no key. Nina sat in silence as the numbers surged. She didn't reply, didn't block, just watched. Every comment was a fragment of the truth or a distraction from it. By 10 a.m., her inbox was flooded. Most were noise, but one message stood out. It came from a woman named Anita Redfern. Handle @BrokenArrowDust, profile pic, a blurred image of Monument Valley at dusk. Message: I think I know whose baby that is. Or at least, who could have carried her. Can we talk? My sister worked for them. The Wards. Back when she still had a name. Nina blinked, reread it twice, then replied with a number. The call came 30 minutes later. Anita's voice was rough, weathered. The kind of voice built in high plains wind and long silences. You Nina Caldwell? Yes. You tell the truth. I try. Good. I don't. Silence. Then my sister's name was Selena. Not legally, but that's what we called her. She worked for the Wards, housemaid, Henderson Estate. Real quiet. Never caused trouble. Then one day gone. Poof. No warning, no goodbyes. Just vanished. Nina's breath caught. When? 7 months ago. Did she leave a baby behind? We never saw one. But she started getting real sick. Throwing up, fatigued. Said it was the cleaning chemicals. I told her she was pregnant. She denied it. And now she's dust. They say she moved to Arizona. But she left her necklace in her locker. She never took that off. Nina's fingers clenched around the phone. Do you have access to anything from the Ward's employee logs, payroll schedules? Anita's laugh was low and sharp. I don't trust screens, but I got files. Can we meet? No, but I'll bring them. Where? Ambrose. Old train station. Midnight. The line went dead. That night, Nina drove out with the documents stashed in her glove compartment. She parked in the back lot, headlights off. Anita appeared like a shadow stitched from earth. She wore denim from head to toe. Her boots were cracked, her hair braided tight. She looked like a woman who had lost too many things to ever speak softly again. She handed Nina a cardboard folder. Inside, photocopies of employment contracts, shift logs, clinic receipts, notes scribbled in margins. Nina flipped through, then paused. One page showed Selena's name alongside several other women, all listed as seasonal domestic aid. All terminated within weeks of each other. 6 names, all brown-skinned, all immigrants, all moved out of state. Nina looked up. Anita didn't smile. They were paid cash, no social security numbers, no benefits, no protection. Nina whispered. Did they all disappear? Anita's voice cracked. They were never meant to exist. A train wailed somewhere in the distance, a low guttural scream through silence. Nina closed the folder. Will you go public? Anita shook her head. My sister's already buried by the system. I won't bury the rest of my family with her. Nina hesitated. Then what do you want from me? I want him to feel fear. The way Selena felt every time she bled and was told to keep scrubbing. Nina's hands trembled. I'll do what I can. Anita stepped back into the dark. Just before vanishing, she said, You're not the first white woman to profit from native blood. Make sure you're the last. Then she was gone. The documents burned a hole in Nina's hands. She returned to the clinic, heart pounding. Evie was waiting. I traced 2 of the names Evie said, lifting her laptop. One tried to report a miscarriage after slipping on stairs while cleaning the Ward estate. Hospital record was flagged, later deleted. By who? No one knows. But the IT access trail leads back to a state-funded clinic. Nina felt her chest tighten. She opened the file again. The spiral tattoo stared up at her like an old curse. This wasn't about one baby. This was about all the women who never got to hold theirs. She looked at Evie. We need to get louder. Evie nodded. I'll prep the medical records. Nina uploaded the folder to a drive, then opened her post again. She typed, This baby wasn't the first. She may be the only one to survive. How many missing women will it take before Nevada listens? She hit post. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of power shifting in its seat. It started with a knock that wasn't really a knock. 3 hard raps on the steel door behind the clinic, measured brutal echoing in the hollow corridor like a countdown. Evie froze. Her hand hovered above a chart. Nina looked up from her screen. They both knew in that animal way that something had changed. When Nina opened the back door, the man standing there wasn't in uniform, but he might as well have been. Tall. Aviators. Shaved head. Suit too crisp for this town. One hand in a jacket pocket, the other holding a coffee cup with a logo from a Las Vegas golf resort. "You Nina Caldwell?" he asked, smiling in a way that made the room feel colder. "I am. I work with a private security group hired by the Ward campaign. We're just here to ensure the safety of all parties involved." "Safety?" "Absolutely." He stepped forward. "Just enough to close the gap. The governor-to-be has concerns that his name might be dragged into a situation he had no involvement with. You understand how that kind of thing can affect polling." "I don't care about his polling." He smiled again. "That's why I'm here." Evie stepped beside her, face stone. "You threatening a civilian on clinic grounds?" He ignored her. "We'd appreciate it if you removed the images you posted. You know, before this gets out of hand." Nina didn't answer, just stared. He nodded toward the alley. "One more thing." He turned slightly, gesturing behind him. The alley was empty, until it wasn't. A soft sound like wind shifting. Ash. He stood at the far end of the lot, hooves planted on red clay. Tail still. Ears flicked forward. He had not moved since the sun rose. "Beautiful animal," the man said, voice now silk. "Shame what happened." "What do you mean?" "Couple of boys drove by earlier, got spooked. Gun went off, near miss. Could have been worse." Nina's heart sank. "You shot him." "Didn't say that." He turned to leave. "Just saying sometimes creatures that roam too far out of bounds get confused. Happens to strays." He walked away, didn't look back. Ash hadn't flinched once. Blood dripped slowly from his left hind flank. A graze, but deep. Nina ran to him, hands trembling. The smell of burnt fur filled the air. She grabbed a towel, pressed it against the wound. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood watching the clinic, watching the world unravel. That night she posted again, not words, just a single image. Ash standing in the storm, his mane whipping like torn silk, his body arched in front of the baby, shielding it from the full rage of wind and dust. No caption, no hashtags, but the internet gave it one, anyway. RedDustChild. Within hours, it was everywhere. Artists painted murals of Ash. Activists made donation links. Veterans commented about the nobility of sacrifice. Poets wrote about sentinels in hooves. The world for a heartbeat saw magic again, but power doesn't bow to poetry. The next morning, an official letter arrived from the Nevada State Department of Agriculture. Subject: equine quarantine order, Mojave region. Reason: possible exposure to hazardous desert fungi. Evie read it twice, then whispered, "They're going to take him." Nina's voice cracked. "They can't. They already have the legal authority. They'll say it's for public safety. They want to erase the symbol. They want to silence the witness." The letter gave them 24 hours. Outside, Ash stood under the broken light post, bleeding quietly. Children had come to see him. A little girl left a red bandana on the ground in front of him. A boy held his hand out. Ash bowed slightly, not a trick, not a trained act. Just recognition. He had become more than a horse. He was now the soul of something ancient and furious. Something this land had always buried, but never destroyed. Nina sat with the photos again. She began sending them first to independent blogs, then to old colleagues, then to an underground reporter's server in Los Angeles. One image went viral. Ash bleeding from the flank, moonlight pooling like silver around his hooves. In the background, blurred but visible, a black SUV with government plates. Another showed the blood trail between Ash and the clinic door. A third was of the bullet casing Nina had found near the trash bin. Each image struck a nerve. The hashtag roared back louder now. RedDustChild, let Ash stay, Desert Guardian. The press began circling. CNN requested an interview. A rep from Democracy Now! Emailed Evie. And on Twitter, someone leaked a list of campaign donors tied to security firms, like the one that had paid a visit. That evening, Anita Redfern returned, this time with 3 other women, older, silent eyes, hardened by time. They carried stories. About girls who bled on white marble floors and were paid in silence. About vans that drove to nowhere with cargo that never spoke again. About names no one remembered. And one name that would not go away now, Clayton Ward. Nina recorded everything. Their faces blurred, voices distorted, but truth vibrating through every frame. As the sun set on Mojave that day, Nina stood beside Ash, her hand on his neck. Reporters stood behind fences. Protesters arrived with signs. Protect the Guardian. We believe the horse dust won't bury truth. Then a truck rolled in, unmarked. 4 men in gray uniforms stepped out. This, the horse one asked. Evie stepped forward. You'll need a warrant. The man smirked. We have Emergency Wildlife Authority. Ash didn't flinch, but he took one step back. Just one. Nina spoke before anyone else could. Touch him. And this becomes national. She held up her phone. Live stream. 22,000 viewers. The man froze. Behind her, children began to chant. Ash, Ash, Ash. The men backed off. They didn't run, but they retreated. And Ash stayed. That night, Nina didn't sleep. She sat in the dark with the baby still recovering, still unnamed, and listened to the silence beyond the clinic. Ash stood beneath the moonlight, eyes closed. Still bleeding, still guarding, still waiting. The sound of tires on gravel woke Nina. Not the soft crunch of a passing car. This was deliberate, heavy, final. She rose from the cot in the clinic's back room, heart pounding. Through the slats of the window, she saw them 3 black and white cruisers pulling into the lot. Dust kicked up behind them like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Evie stood already in the hallway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a pale line. They're here, she said, with the order. Nina didn't answer. She walked past her through the hallway, down the ramp to the main room where Ash still stood under the shade of the half-broken awning. And the baby now rested in a cot by the window, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of sage and sweat and time. The door burst open. 2 officers stepped in, flanked by a third, a sheriff, older face lined by sun and bureaucracy. His name tag read, Turner. Ms. Caldwell, he said, voice rehearsed. We're here to collect the animal in question. Under the Nevada State Wildlife Code 1492B, Emergency Equine Containment Agency. On whose authority, she asked. Governor's Provisional Task Force. That's not a real thing. It is today. Ash raised his head, just slightly, his ears pinned back. The silence thickened. Sheriff Turner's hand hovered near his holster. Let's not make this more complicated than it already is. Evie stepped forward. This is a medical facility. You have no jurisdiction to remove a living being under treatment. He's not under treatment, Turner snapped. He's an unregistered, injured wild animal, and a potential threat to civilians. Ash didn't move, but something in the room shifted. Nina turned to the baby. As if sensing the storm, the girl stirred. Then she opened her eyes. For the first time since Nina had found her. Deep brown, clear, awake. Nina took a step closer. The baby blinked and smiled, tiny, instinctive, pure. Then she lifted her hand toward Ash. A gurgle escaped her lips, half cry, half laugh. Everyone froze. Ash stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and made a sound Nina had never heard before. Not a neigh, not a whinny, a deep, guttural roar that echoed off the concrete walls of the clinic and seemed to rattle the dust from the windows. Sheriff Turner flinched. The baby laughed harder. Ash stepped between the cot and the officers. Nina's chest collapsed with emotion. A dam broke. Her breath came ragged. This horse, she said, eyes on Turner, is the reason she's alive. Step aside, Ms. Caldwell. No. You'll be charged with obstruction. Then charge me. Evie, too. Evie didn't blink. You'll need 3 sets of cuffs. Why 3? A voice came from the door. Anita Redfern. Her boots dusty, her hands firm. She stepped inside. Because I'm not leaving either. Turner looked between them. Nina's heart raced. Then Ash took another step forward and stood still. In the stillness, something ancient pulsed. Not rage, not resistance. Conviction. That night they were given until dawn. Turner agreed quietly to hold the order. 1 night, that's all. Evie locked the clinic doors. Anita held the baby. Nina stood outside with Ash. The stars burned cold above Mojave. Silent, endless. She ran her hand down Ash's neck, felt the heat of him, the scars beneath the fur, the heartbeat that didn't just pulse, but remembered. She whispered, "They'll take her, Ash, if I stay." Ash didn't respond. He simply turned toward the desert, toward the dark, toward freedom. The answer was clear. She stepped back inside. Packed formula, diapers, a blanket, her Leica. She looked at Evie. "You'll be okay?" Evie nodded. "Go." Anita handed her the baby. "She's already stronger than any of us." Nina nodded, opened the back door. Ash was waiting. The baby nestled in her arms, quiet. Calm. Ash stepped beside her, lowered his head. Together, under cover of night, they left. The road was cracked, forgotten, half swallowed by time. Moonlight guided their way. No headlights, no map, just trust. Dust rose behind Ash's hooves. The air grew colder. At one point, Nina whispered, "Where are we going?" But Ash didn't answer. He just kept moving. Somewhere far behind, Mojave slept, or watched, or turned its back. Nina looked down at the baby. She was smiling in her sleep. A piece of torn denim covered her. On it, a blood-stain shaped like a wing. Ash's wing, Ash's mark. At dawn, they reached the edge of the canyon. Below, the world opened. Ash stopped. The sun rose behind him, casting a long shadow across the valley floor. In that light, he looked almost unreal, like something pulled from legend. Nina dismounted, held the baby to her chest. She looked at Ash. He looked back. Not goodbye, not even farewell. "Just go," she nodded. Turned toward the trail. Ash reared slightly, and then vanished down the cliffside. His body became a blur of dust and wind and memory. And Nina, she walked, with the baby in her arms, toward the unknown, but not alone, never again alone. The wind felt different this time. Still dry, still merciless, but laced with something else, clarity. Nina stood at the edge of the Mojave, where the red earth met a sky too wide to hold lies. The cactus loomed just ahead, its spines twisted like truth that refused to die. Ash walked beside her, each step pressing into the dust like punctuation to a sentence only nature could write. The baby nestled against Nina's chest, calm and curious. She had stopped crying days ago. This was where it had started. Where someone had decided this life was disposable. Now it would be where the world would hear the truth. Nina unzipped her backpack. Inside, neatly folded, were the documents, the photographs, the recordings, every scrap of proof she had fought to preserve. DNA reports linking the baby to Clayton Ward. Hospital documents with forged discharge notes. A time-stamped photo of the embroidered cloth. The zoomed-in still of Clayton's tattoo, half faded, half masked, but undeniable. She set up her old Leica, aimed it toward the cactus. Ash stepped into frame. No one told him to. He just knew. He stood tall, wind lifting his mane. His chest streaked with dried blood, his eyes dark and full of storm memory. A silhouette of resilience carved into a dying world. Nina turned on the camera. She didn't practice her words. She didn't need to. "My name is Nina Caldwell," she said, voice shaking, then settling. "I'm standing here with the child you left behind, Mr. Ward, with the being who saved her." She lifted a piece of the cloth, held it up to the camera. "You remember this, don't you? The blanket you wrapped her in. The same pattern as the scarf in your car. The same symbol inked into your own skin." She took a breath. "You buried her here like a secret. But Mojave doesn't bury secrets, it preserves them. And she survived. Because something wild chose not to look away." Nina turned the camera briefly toward the baby. The child blinked into the light, then smiled. No fear, just peace. She turned the camera back to Ash. "He never left her side," Nina said, tears catching in her throat. When humans forgot, this creature remembered. Nina ended the recording. She attached the files to a message to Evie, to Anita, to 3 trusted journalists, and uploaded it all to an encrypted cloud. Then she pressed send. It was done. She sat down beside Ash, legs crossed, eyes closed. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid. They waited in the silence of the high desert. Then it began. A distant hum, low at first, then building. Nina opened her eyes. On the horizon, helicopters. But not police, not military. These bore medical insignias, news station logos, humanitarian colors. The lead chopper hovered low. A rope dropped. From it descended a woman, dark hair in a braid, desert glasses over sharp eyes. Anita Redfern. Behind her came Evie, and a small camera crew documenting every second. Nina stood, held the baby close. No running this time. She walked to meet them. Evie reached her first. They embraced. We saw everything, Evie whispered. It's everywhere. The footage went viral in an hour. RedDustChild is trending. The governor's being questioned. Clayton's campaign is collapsing in real time. Anita stepped toward Ash. She didn't speak. She simply placed a painted handprint on his shoulder. A mark of honor, a blessing, a thank you. Ash stood still. His eyes for once seemed at ease. Evie touched Nina's arm. You did it. No, Nina said softly, looking toward Ash. We did. The baby, now between them, reached toward the sky. Pointed. A second wave of helicopters began to land, reporters, medics, aid workers. The media had arrived, but this time not to distort the story, to witness it. Amid the rising chaos, Ash stepped back. His head turned toward the hills. His posture shifted, alert, restless. Nina saw it in his eyes. He was ready to go. She walked over, laid a hand on his scarred neck. You don't have to stay anymore. Ash looked at her one last time. Then he ran, not away, toward open land, wind silence, toward whatever waited beyond civilization. As he climbed the nearest ridge, the light from the setting sun caught his body in profile. On the highest point, he reared up, hooves flaring, mane, wild breath, visible, a living myth. Then he vanished over the crest, leaving behind only a single perfect hoofprint in the red sand, a mark on the earth, and on every soul watching. The video went live at 5:42 a.m. By 600, it had been shared over 50,000 times. By 700, it was on every major news outlet's front page. By noon, Clayton Ward held a press conference. His face pale, his wife absent, his voice stripped of rhetoric. He looked into the camera and read a brief, cold statement. I am withdrawing from the race for governor of Nevada. I will fully cooperate with legal authorities. He did not say her name. He did not mention the child. The media filled in the blanks, but it was too late to control the story now. The people had already decided who the real guardians were. Legal proceedings moved quickly. DNA. Tampered birth records, witness testimony from former house staff, especially from Anita's sister, who had survived years of silence before finally stepping forward. Charges were filed: child endangerment, obstruction of justice, falsifying medical documentation, and conspiracy to suppress identity. The court set a trial date within 3 months. Meanwhile, a judge, visibly moved by Nina's footage and community outcry, granted her temporary custody of the baby. Within 60 days, it became permanent. The girl was given a new name, one chosen under an open sky. She was no longer a secret. She was someone now. Ash was never captured. Animal control came once, but the public backlash fueled by viral footage of him shielding the child during the sandstorm was too fierce. Activists, lawmakers, and everyday citizens petitioned for his protection. Within a week, a non-profit organization, the Mojave Wildlife Guardians, filed for legal stewardship of Ash. He was designated a sentient protector of historical significance. It was the first time in state history such a title had ever been granted. Ash remained in the wild, but everyone knew where to find him. Just before sunset, near the ridge, where hoofprints had burned into the sand like scripture. 1 year later, the desert was quiet again, but not forgotten. People began visiting the place where the child had been left, not to grieve, to remember, to feel, to heal. A local sculptor herself, a survivor of family trauma, volunteered to create something lasting. It took 3 months. She never charged a cent. On the anniversary of the rescue, people gathered, dozens, then hundreds. Nina held the girl, now walking, laughing, speaking. They unveiled the statue together. It stood taller than any man, cast in bronze, weathered into the sand. A child in swaddling cloth arms wrapped around the neck of a wild horse, rearing against the wind. The horse's mane flared like fire. The child's face tilted upward, not in fear, but in trust. On the base of the statue, carved deep into steel, love does not ask what you are. Ash didn't attend, but the wind seemed to quiet that day, like the desert too was listening. The girl began calling him brother. No one taught her that. She just said it one evening when she saw his silhouette on the ridge again, backlit by sunset. His body motionless, except for the flick of his tail. Brother, she whispered, and Ash turned his head. That was all, but it was enough. Nina returned to photography, not for newspapers, not for stories of war and disaster. She began a series called Unheard Portraits of Children Without Birth Certificates, of women with sealed pasts, of animals saved from the brink. The cover photo, Ash, standing by the cactus, head bowed, scar glowing in the light. The book sold out in 3 days. Profits funded shelters, new clinics, and desert sanctuaries. Schools began teaching the story of the RedDustChild, not just for drama, but for ethics, for justice, for empathy. Every year on the date the video went live, students wrote essays. Some drew, others danced. One child simply stood in front of her class and said, "I believe we're all made of dust." But some dust remembers. Anita continued her advocacy. Evie opened a mobile clinic in the desert communities. Ash remained wild, but sightings increased. He no longer ran when people approached. Sometimes he stood for a photo, other times he vanished like smoke. But always he returned. He knew what was his, not to possess, but to guard. And the girl, she grew tall, sun-kissed, eyes like flint but soft. When asked about her earliest memory, she didn't mention fear or abandonment. She said one word, warm. She remembered a heartbeat, a body between her and the storm, a shadow with hooves. Years passed. The world changed. But in Mojave, when the wind howled at night, people swore they could hear something else beneath it. The cry of a child, the roar of a stallion, the echo of a promise made not with words, but with presence. In the red dust, some stories were written, others were carved, and a few, a rare sacred few, were burned in by hoof prints, never to be erased.